Hi, my name is Laura Kuhl, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the International Affairs program. My research focuses on climate change adaptation in developing countries and the barriers and policy implications of adaptation programming. I've done a lot of work with multilateral organizations, including the United Nations Development Program, USAID, and the Global Environment Facility, looking at the way that their programs are supporting developing countries to design and implement adaptation policies. Resilience is a really kind of hot topic right now, and it certainly has gained a lot of momentum in international development. When we think about resilience, it's something that we envision always as a positive trait. Everyone wants to be resilient, but there's been some critical views on resilience, and particularly for climate change adaptation, that's important. When we think about resilience, it's about bouncing back to what has been before after a stress or a shock. And one of the concerns is that sometimes what you're starting from might not be an ideal place. So poor countries and particularly vulnerable communities, bouncing back to what they were before might not be the ideal place. So when I think about resilience, I think about it less from kind of that classic definition of bouncing back to what we were before, and more in terms of resilience capacities. There's a framework developed by a series of authors led by Benet et al. That thinks of resilience in terms of three types of capacities: coping capacities to deal with small stresses and events, small shocks that can be managed; adaptive capacities that require some sort of changes to the system; and then transformative capacities that really require changing to an entirely new system. And one of the things I really like about this framework is that it allows us to think about kind of an active role for individuals and communities in building their own resilience. Resilience is really key to understanding climate adaptation. The concept has really gained a lot of momentum within the field. And one of the things about resilience is that it's about thinking about kind of a holistic understanding of development. And climate adaptation plays one part. Climate impacts are one type of shock or stress that can impact resilience, but there's obviously a whole other bunch of other shocks and stresses that individuals, communities, nations face. And so when we think about the role of climate adaptation in resilience planning, can think of it as one component among a whole bunch of broader issues that also impact resilience. One of the ways that climate adaptation can really provide a useful framing, I think, for understanding resilience is that a lot of the sort of underlying structural causes of vulnerability are political, they're social, they're cultural, and they're deeply embedded in societies. And because of that, they can be really difficult to tackle directly. By thinking about resilience from a climate adaptation standpoint, all of a sudden it opens up opportunities to address some of those structural issues in a kind of apolitical fashion. So it provides stakeholders with a new way of thinking about the issue, and so they can use kind of the science of climate impacts, the understanding of climate vulnerabilities as a way to address some of those broader development challenges. Both climate adaptation and resilience are important issues at all scales, from the international to the national, all the way down to the level of the individual. But when we think about implementation of adaptation planning, then it's usually at the local level, at both kind of the local government and the community level, that these issues really get developed. When we think about the challenges that local communities face with designing and implementing resilience policies and plans, there's a couple of things from my experience that really stand out. One is that although there's increasing momentum and interest in addressing these issues, most local governments and communities feel like they don't fully understand climate impacts. They don't understand the science behind climate change. It's hard to understand what the projections are for impacts in their specific region. And as a result, they also struggle to identify what would be appropriate climate adaptation responses. So one way to address this is, of course, to continue building up the capacity to understand climate impacts, to understand the science of climate change, as well as the responses to it. And this is something that's urgently needed all around the world. At the same time, I would really urge people to help communities and local governments understand that climate change is not something completely new. Most of the ways that adaptation is going to be addressed are by building up the more general resilience of communities. And so even though climate change might be something new from a planning perspective that they've never addressed before, the types of shocks and stresses that they'll be facing are similar to shocks and stresses that they've faced in the past. And so there actually is a huge wealth of knowledge and information that they can draw on from their own communities and from their own past experiences to do some of that resilience planning. One of the things that we're seeing a lot in kind of conversations around adaptation is a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between climate impacts, adaptation, and resilience. Whereas in the past, it was always thought of in terms of vulnerability and kind of moving directly from vulnerability to responses, now there's kind of a more holistic understanding of the interactions between climate change, development, and resilience planning as a whole. And one of the things that I find really exciting about this is it allows for new opportunities to think about climate change as kind of a positive driver of change and development. We're so used to thinking about climate change only in terms of kind of the negative consequences of climate impacts. But as we see kind of more and more resilience thinking moving into this field, I think we're seeing greater and greater opportunities for sort of new paradigms for thinking about development as a whole. Climate change is one of the biggest threats facing the world right now, and one of the ways that it will make one of the biggest differences is in developing countries. Developing countries are extremely vulnerable to climate change, not only because of their sensitivity to climate impacts and their exposure to them, but also because they lack the same adaptive capacity to deal with climate impacts that we see in places like the United States, where there's many more resources to deal with these types of changes. So when we think about climate impacts, we have to think more broadly about how is this going to affect the development trajectory. And one of the challenges is that even though as a global community, we've made huge progress in the past 10, 20 years on major goals like reducing poverty and addressing malnutrition. There's a great danger that with climate change, some of this progress may be halted or even reversed. It will require rethinking the way that we design these types of development interventions, as well as the way that governments plan for economic development in general in order to address these climate impacts and incorporate these impacts into the development trajectory.